Hello everyone, I am Chirag Thakkar, Commissioning Editor at Roli Books, and you're watching Roli Pulse, a new digital initiative. Remember, you can check out all our previous sessions, the author interactions that we've been putting together on Roli Books' YouTube channel. And if you haven't yet subscribed to it, please do so now. You can also find our content on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Twitter. If you would like us to put out more such content, then please show us your love. Type in your comments in the comment section below and share this with anyone you wish to. Today's conversation is on the Indian economy going forward. Much has been said about the gung ho with which the Modi government came to power in India, first in 2014 and then again in 2019, on the promise of development for all, on economic growth and a flourishing economy, among others. And yet, as things the way they happened would have it, in these 6 years of being in power, this government and India has seen some of the worst economic indicators. The highest rates of unemployment in the country, sinking and bleeding markets, an already always slumping GDP growth rate, a distressed rural and agrarian economy, not to mention the popular discontent around demonetization and the arbitrarily introduced goods and services tax. With the coronavirus pandemic and how badly it has affected the economy and society, throwing many parts of the world into a painful cycle of recession, much has also been said since the Indian government announced its stimulus package to boost the economy. Yet, the one thing no one can possibly disagree with at the moment is that it's going to be a long, long road to recovery. Speaking about this and a whole lot more are Sanjay Baru, Omkar Goswami, and Dhiraj Nayyar. Sanjay Baru is Distinguished Fellow at Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis and United Service Institution of India. He's been editor of India's major financial newspapers such as the Economic Times, Financial Express, and Business Standard. Sanjay has been formerly media advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and director for Geoeconomics and Strategy, International Institute of Strategic Studies, London. Many of you, of course, might know of his best-selling book, The Accidental Prime Minister. Omkar Goswami is with us. Omkar is an economist and business journalist. He's the founder and chairperson of Corporate and Economic Research Group Advisory Private Limited, which advises companies in India and abroad. He has served as advisor on government committees and the World Bank, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the International Monetary Fund, as well as the Asian Development Bank. Sanjay and Omkar are going to be in conversation with Dhiraj, who is chief economist at Vedanta Resources. He has formerly been officer on special duty and head of economics, finance, and commerce at Niti Aayog with the government of India. Dhiraj has held several senior positions in the media, including opinion editor at Financial Express, deputy editor at India Today, and the India columnist for Bloomberg View. So welcome to this conversation, each of you. I do hope you enjoy this conversation. Dhiraj, why don't you get us started with the discussion?
Good evening and welcome to Roli Pulse, a digital initiative of Roli Books. You may have seen some of the earlier debates and discussions. Today we are going to be talking about the economy, the way forward for the economy. So let me begin by asking Omkar Goswami and Sanjay Baru, where do you think the economy is right now? We're just emerging from 2 months, or more than 2 months of lockdown in the midst of a global pandemic. And where do we stand right now? How bad is it? Omkar, would you like to?
Sure. The answer is very bad. Even before the pandemic, which hit us in March, we were from last year onwards, for 4 successive quarters, every quarter has shown successively falling rate of real GDP growth. That is GDP growth without inflation. Every successive quarter. And with 6 days or 7 days of work lost throughout India in the lockdown, the last quarter, that is January to March of 2020, has shown the lowest quarterly growth in 11 years of 3.1%. And overall, the growth for the fiscal year 1920 is at a real low of 4.1%. So we, even without the pandemic, because the pandemic was only 7 days of that last fiscal year, we were in a very bad place where we were limping along and limping worse and worse with every passing quarter. I will come later to what the pandemic does. So we've started with a bad book.
Sanjay Baru, is this the worst economic shock to hit us after independence? Or do you think 1991 was worse?
Thank you, Dhiraj. Let me first say that I agree with Omkar, and therefore I will not repeat whatever he has said. Your specific question, whether this is the worst crisis we are facing, it's a difficult question to answer for a simple reason, that 1991 was a short brought onto ourselves by events that happened essentially between 1987, 88 and 1993, a 4-year period in which the fiscal deficit rose sharply, the balance of payments was getting into trouble. And then external factors, the Gulf War and the oil shock, triggered a crisis. This time is different. And so in that sense, it may be worse, because this time the crisis is entirely internal. The pandemic is the external shock, but I will come to the pandemic later. I agree with Omkar's assessment that the economy was in trouble. And if you ask the question, why was the economy in trouble? The economy has been in trouble essentially for 2 reasons. One is a purely economic reason, which is the secular decline in the investment rate and the savings rate over a fairly long period of time, about 5 to 6 years. And we have seen an increase in the investment rate from somewhere in the late 90s right through till 2010, 2012, and then a decline in the rate of investment. And that is an important long-term phenomenon that is still with us. But the second reason, in my judgment, why this crisis is worse is because in 1991, the government of the day understood the nature of the crisis and took measures to address the crisis. I think what has happened here is that the government of the day has not understood the nature of the crisis. And therefore, you had a budget presented in July, which was in complete denial of the problem, of the medium to long-term problem, which required the government to, in fact, come forward with all kinds of changes by August, September, October. In other words, the budget of July was rewritten over the next 3-4 months. And even before that began to yield any dividends in terms of, we had the pandemic. So this is worse for the combination of political and economic factors that have contributed to the slowdown. In the turnaround, the dramatic turnaround that happened gave us confidence that the political leadership of the country understood this. Today, the fact is that there is still a lack of confidence whether the political leadership has a grasp of the nature of the crisis, at least in the way in which it is articulating policy. And to me, that is as worrisome as the economic causes for the slowdown, etc.
Thanks, Sanjay. So we will get into the details of the government response and what more can be done and so on. But before that,
can I just cut in and give you 2 factoids other than what happened in 91, 92 after 1991, is that we've had 2 very nasty swings in right from 1950-51 when we've measured GDP. We've had 2 very nasty swings before this one, which will be nasty. One was between 64-65 and 65-66 when the famine took place, when the major famine and the food shortage took place, where GDP dropped from real GDP from 7.6% to 3.7%, which meant a swing of 11.3 percentage points. And the second was during the second oil shock rather, and the war in Iraq, where between 78, 79 and 79, 80, GDP dropped from 5.5% to minus 5.2%. So it was a swing of 10.7 percentage points. Now, what we need to debate is how much will it drop this time?
In fact, yeah, that's where I was coming to before we get into the more detailed analysis of what the government has done. But in fact, there's a range of forecasts being made. Pranab Sen, the former chief statistician of India, said that his estimate is that it's going to be minus 11.5% for 2020-21. That's the one end. I think that's the worst I get. You have a lot of international banks and economists saying minus 5%. You have the chief economic advisor of the government and IMF, World Bank saying 2%, maybe 4% at the most. The consensus seems to be that this may be the first year, Omkar, since 1979, the year you just mentioned, where growth is likely to be negative. Where do you, and I'll ask both of you, starting with you, Omkar, where do you see us ending up on this, in this range from minus 11 to say plus 3?
I think Pranab is not talking of a swing of minus 11. He's saying GDP will become minus 11. So I think we have to talk about what the GDP is now for 2019 and what it will be for 2020-21, and then see what the swing is, right? So I believe that my sense is we will move from 4.1% growth in 2019 to something like minus 5%, minus 4 or minus 5% growth in 2020. So we're going to have a swing of either around 8% or 9% from 4.1 to minus 4% or 4.1 to minus 5%. So that's the kind of thing I believe will happen.
Sanjay, do you have a view on where you see it ending up?
Well, I mean, I have not looked at the numbers. Omkar is the expert on numbers, but I will go with his assessment of the kind of decline. But the fact is that since you mentioned the views of the chief economic advisor, I think, what is very important in going forward, because they're ahead of us to decide whether it's going to be minus 5%, minus 4%, minus 3%, whatever the swing for the fiscal. We need credible communication. I think we are not, distinguish ourselves from 91. The chief economic advisor of 1991, I'm sorry to say this, happens to be Dhiraj's father. I'm not making this personal, but we had credible assessments of the economy being offered by the chief economic advisor, and credibility of the assessment, even if that assessment does not favor the government of the day. A credible assessment of what is happening is critical for the economic agents to take decisions. And therefore, going forward, I think you need far more credibility in policy communication, in the assessment of where we are, so that, market participants, whether it's, they will react to these signals. And if these signals are credible, we can actually have a better recovery going forward than is likely if you have, bravado and talking and throwing up all kinds of unbelievable numbers. I mean, I remember last year I used to argue with a lot of people in government saying, don't go around saying that Indian economy will be $5 trillion by 2025. It will not be $5 trillion, by 2024. And you will only hurt your own credibility because 2024 is not too far away. Everybody has now stopped talking about $5 trillion. And of course, they will say, oh, it cannot be $5 trillion in 2024 because of COVID. On the other hand, it would not have been $5 trillion. And I think that is the lesson for policymakers, that credible communication is extremely important for the economic actors, for investors, for consumers, etc. To a positive way to whatever stimuli the government is likely to offer to take the economy forward.
Dhiraj, just to pop in again before you ask your next question. One of the, building on what Sanjay is saying, one of the most, I would say, disappointing aspects of the present government, and it goes back to not just the Modi version 2, but it goes back to 5-7 years, is that the people who are in the Ministry of Finance, and it's not just the finance minister, but the people, the senior people working, have moved away from a notion of credibility and a notion of giving the right numbers to a situation where they have become conjoined band leaders. And you know, everyone sees through it. No one buys it, starting from right at the top. And I think people don't understand it. And the people in power don't understand that this kind of band leading doesn't work. Everyone sees through it.
Yeah. So, Sanjay, since you broached the subject of a $5 trillion economy, the one overarching feature of the economic package that was announced by the Prime Minister to start with and then the Finance Minister is this theme of Atmanirbhar Bharat. So clearly the overarching narrative for the last many years has been $5 trillion economy by 2024-25 now seems to have switched to Atmanirbhar Bharat. Is there a plan beyond the overarching goal or slogan?
First of all, I don't see any contradiction between seeking a $5 trillion economy and pursuing a strategy which is called Atmanirbhar Bharat. Because first of all, Atmanirbharta or self-reliance has been a strategy that we have followed right from independence. It's not a new thing. After all, self-reliance was the objective of policy making even in the 50s. But the change that has happened, you know, is a very interesting change. In the 50s and 60s, we defined self-reliance as reducing dependence on the world economy, right? So inward orientation of the economy, etc. But in 1991, when we liberalized the economy and reduced tariffs, opened up the economy to foreign investment, and integrated the Indian economy to the rest of the world, a very famous speech at the April 1992 session of the All India Congress Committee, explaining his version of self-reliance, which is very interesting. He said that self-reliance today is not just reducing dependence from the rest of the world, but it is about creating interdependence with the rest of the world. In fact, the formulation there, if my memory serves me right, he said, India needs the world, but the world also needs India. And therefore, we have to create relationships of interdependence. Interdependence also creates self-reliance. The entire Chinese strategy, the Deng 1980, was actually one of creating global interdependence so that the world needed China as much as China needed the world. And the delinking or decoupling that President Trump is trying to do now is to precisely end that so that the world, or at least the United States, needs China less than need the US, right? So Atmanirbharta, or the new facts, if it means simply building a more competitive domestic economy, I have no problem with that. But if it means delinking ourselves from the rest of the world, as Omkar correctly said a little while back, I don't think that's going to work. Because at the end of the day, it is resources dependent. We need to import technology, we need to import resources, oil, etc. And for this, we need to continue to export, and you have to export in a competitive manner. And we are in many ways a globalized economy, and that you cannot go away from that. And to come back to your question of whether you can be Atmanirbhar and also 5 trillion, I don't see a contradiction in that, provided we know exactly in what areas we want to build self-reliance and in what areas we're going to pursue a more interdependent strategy with the rest of
Omkar Goswami, I wanted to ask you the follow-up. I mean, whether it's 5 trillion, Atmanirbhar Bharat, Sanjay Baru doesn't see a contradiction. But are you satisfied with the plan the government has to achieve either of those goals?
I have a somewhat wicked view about the word Atmanirbhar coming into public space today. I'm almost 100% sure that this word came from the mind of Prime Minister Modi. कि हमें आत्मनिर्भरता दिखाना चाहिए. Okay. Now, once it came out of his mind, everyone else had to adopt it and fashion it in the way they thought was right. So I don't know exactly what this Atmanirbhar Bharat means. Okay. All I know of Atmanirbhar Bharat is coming out of 5 days of policy pronouncements that came out from the finance minister, 5 consecutive days. And I don't see too much of it So I'm not sure what it means, but I do know that the origin of it, and I'm willing to guess, came from 7 Racecourse Road. And since it came from there, everyone has to adopt it, right?
But I mean, to be fair, so far, the one obvious worry is that this is a lurch back to import substitution of the kind that Sanjay talked about.
No, to be fair, it's not. We haven't seen that in any of the policy pronouncements. Sanjay is quite right that if all of this comes under the rubric of Atmanirbhar Bharat, we haven't seen the kind of stuff that we had earlier in the pre-1990s. No.
Right. So let's talk a little bit, since we're talking about the way forward, about those 5 days of announcements that the finance minister made. Itself an unusual strategy, and I wonder what Sanjay Baru makes of it as a communication strategy, 5 consecutive days of announcements. But I mean, there were broadly 2 parts to it. One was the stimulus part and one was the structural reforms part. So Sanjay, just to ask you first, and what did you think of the stimulus part? Again, there is a dispute. Most people expect the fiscal outgo is about 1 to 1.5%, but then Surjit Bhalla, who's our ED to the IMF, says that it's actually closer to 5%. But leaving aside, that nitty-gritty, how much do you think it will do for our situation? And do you think that communication, because I'm tempted to ask you on the communication, do you think that was the right way to communicate the vision and the way forward?
Well, on communication, I've written quite a few columns in the last month or so. I think on communication from day one, it has been disaster. A few days ago, I heard Amitabh Kant of Niti Aayog say to Rajdeep Sardesai on television that the biggest problem we have today is the problem of fear. And I asked the question, who created that fear? The fear was created by the Prime Minister and nobody. The very manner in which he first and second addressed the nation when the lockdown was imposed. So the whole problem of communication with COVID and lockdown has been a negative communication. We are not yet into the territory of positive communication. Now, coming specifically to the economic policy communication, I have again said that 5 consecutive days of press conference, I think complete waste of time, completely meaningless. I don't know who it was meant to address, because 3, 4 in the afternoon, very few people are watching television to get excited for them. The fact is that once the Prime Minister's speech raised, to then unbundle the initiatives into a series of announcements each day, that too once said in English, then said in Hindi, over a 1-hour press conference, I think a complete waste of time. The government should have had one single statement coming directly from the Prime Minister, no one else, that this is the problem the economy is facing. This is what the lockdown has done. We are mindful of the problems and we are going to take A, B, C, D 5 steps, and all this will be known to you as we take those steps going forward. And if there had been clarity of that kind of communication, then I can answer your question about stimulus more clearly. Because frankly, stimulus is not just about how much money you spend. That is where many economists go wrong in thinking stimulus is in terms of percentage of GDP, how much cash is injected into the economy. The stimulus has to come from changing mindsets. We have been in a territory of negative mindsets, of people worried for their future, worried for their life. So the consumer today, hold back consumption. What is the mindset of the investor today? Hold back investment. So we are in a regime where people are holding back. Now, has the whatever X lakh crores of spending altered this mindset? I'm afraid not. By the end of the end of lockdown, by continued, this morning's newspapers say Arvind Kejriwal has decided to seal off Delhi from its neighbors. We thought there was something called National Capital Region, people living in Noida, traveling to Gurgaon. How do you do these things and then expect a positive? If you don't get a positive outlook, people are going to only be risk averse. And risk aversion will negate the whole idea of stimulus.
Omkar, you've written, of course, a number of pieces saying that the stimulus be a second dose. Is the government waiting for the economy to open up? Because there's one view which says that there's no point putting cash into people's hands as long as the lockdown continues. So is there more to come? Do you think there's more to come? Should more come? And to Sanjay's point, you have a reaction to the intangible, the confidence factor. When will that come back? How will that come back?
Let me take the second point first, the intangible. On one day in July 1991, two things happened. In the morning, with the new government coming in, with Narasimha Rao as Prime Minister and Manmohan Singh as Finance Minister. In the morning at 10 a.m., the new industrial policy was announced. And those days, if you remember, the budget used to be at 5 p.m. And in the evening at 5 p.m., Dr. Manmohan Singh, who's a very poor orator, announced the budget. Okay, these two acts in one day, because of the coherence of these two things, created a confidence in the worst possible situation that India was in. What I have seen are 5 very long, pretty incoherent sets of measures between stimulus and policy reforms. All of them are meant to have many PowerPoints in the deck. They are incoherent in the way in which it is done, except somehow to get a number of 20 lakh crore. Okay, and everyone has seen through it. And to answer your second question, yes, I expect some more stimulus, because the first is too little. Forget about it being 0.8% or 0.9% of GDP, not more than that, the stimulus part. But it's too little, and I expect more. But for it to make sense, people have to think sensibly, rather than thinking, what is it that I should do to make the leader happy?
I'll just follow up to that. There's a lot of talk, again, in terms of economy going forward in political circles and intellectual circles, about India attracting business from China, that firms are exiting China. They were already doing so because of high wages. Now they may do so because they want to diversify supply chains in the post-COVID scenario. I mean, have we done enough to attract this? Is this wishful thinking, or can this be reality with a few more changes? Omkar, what would you say?
As of now, I think it's wishful thinking. It needs a lot of changes, not a few. For very simple. If you want companies to come into India, you have to give them access to land quickly. You have to get all the permissions to be done fast, and they have to be able to set things up quickly, and you have to give them logistics at the end of the day, right? None of these things happen in a day. I'm happy that the government is thinking of it, but it has a long road to travel before they actually execute it. So it's the right direction if they're actually thinking of it, but a lot of work needs to be done, both at the central level, but more than central at this level of the states.
Sanjay, Amit Shah, who's an influential minister in this government, has also been propagating over the last couple of days in interviews that, we should buy Indian. I think this is a larger narrative also going on, apart from attracting firms from China, that we should buy Indian, substitute Chinese goods, don't buy Chinese, buy Indian, don't buy foreign, buy Indian. I mean, where does this all lead us to? I mean, is it going to actually be, what he's saying is, and what the government is trying to sell is that this is the way to boost growth, you promote domestic industry. But is this too simplistic a view of how the economy can be revived?
Sorry, let me take both questions. On the specific first question about FDI coming from China to India, there's an interesting contradiction in government policy at the moment. So, and I have again raised this question in a recent column and waiting for an answer, which is that what are the firms that are located in China doing? They are using China as a base, not just to feed the Chinese economy, but to also feed their export-oriented units. Now, under pressure from President Trump, American companies are being asked to leave China. Right, they will leave China. They are also probably under pressure not to be dependent on the Chinese market. But surely they will all be dependent, continue to be dependent on the Asian market, on Korea, Japan, right? We have decided not to be a member of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a plurilateral free trade agreement being negotiated in the Asian context. If I am an American company leaving China, but I want to continue to be in the Asian market, why would I go to India, which wants to stay outside the RCEP? I would rather go to Vietnam, which is precisely what they're doing. I'd rather go to Malaysia or to Indonesia. So what is, instead of attracting business from China, if it is only about getting companies to sell in India, goes against the other slogan, Indian buy Indian, which is that you are asking American companies to produce in India for the Indian market. This morning's newspaper has a lovely story which says that a lot of consumers are already confused with the names. They go to the market and say, I don't want to buy Colgate, I'll buy Vico Vajradanti. And the manufacturers of Colgate are saying, we are an Indian company, 100 of our Indians, workers are Indians, so don't treat us as a foreign company. The same applies for Philips. There's a company called Havells, which is in electronics, which is a very successful company, 100% Indian owned. The name is Western, a lot of Western names, right? So there is confusion. What exactly is the policy of Be Indian, Buy Indian? And what is the policy of bringing an FDI into India? How do these gel? Now, for Amit Shah to say this, I mean, there is a domestic constituency within the BJP, the RSS, the Swadeshi constituency, which has always been there. Incidentally, there's not much difference between them and the old left. So Be Indian, Buy Indian is an old slogan. I've no problem with that, but it has to be part of some macro policy. And looking for, if you want to bring in foreign investment into India, and we are liberalizing FDI policy, is this only for domestic market? If it's for the international market, what are we doing about the trade agreements? We are wanting to end all free trade agreements that Manmohan Singh negotiated. Where are the markets then? And if the domestic market is the market you are bringing in foreign investment to, then how can you say, buy Indian? Because they are all foreign companies that will manufacture in India.
So, Omkar, just a follow up to this question on foreign investment being part of global supply chain. In India, we've had this long obsession or long romanticization of MSMEs, and most of them in India tend to be more micro than even medium. A lot of the attention of the government in this package has also been on MSMEs for obvious reasons that they employ a large number of people and they're small businesses and small entrepreneurs. But are our MSMEs in a position to be part of, forget global value chains, even regional value chains?
So Dhiraj, as far as the MSME part is concerned, there are two parts to it. One are the stimulus, is the stimulus and the reforms, but mostly the stimulus, partly through RBI and somewhat through the Ministry of Finance that has been announced. That is not about there being a part of a global supply chain or an Indian supply chain. It's exactly what you said. They employ a large number of people. They have huge working capital problems right now. And somehow they've got to get onto track in terms of getting people back at work and starting their output. Can they be a part of an Indian supply chain or a global supply chain? No, they can't, because they simply don't have the scale. Do they have a place in India, irrespective of not being a part of a global supply chain? Yes, they do. Because just to give an example, and I'll give this example in two parts. Basic bearings are bearings that are machined in larger establishments are actually the first bit of forging that takes place is mostly in MSMEs. Then it gets machined in larger establishments, and then it goes to being a part of a capital good or a part of a vehicle. Now, as far as China is concerned, let me give you one example. And I know this well. Take motorcycles and scooters. Do you know that 85% of the alloy wheels, wheels on which motorcycles run, 85% of it is produced in China. And it is going to be very difficult for us to substitute that unless we build up capacities to produce it. Similarly, about 40% of the components, particularly the electronic components that go into motorcycles and scooters, are got from China. So in a way we have, or for that matter, 40% to 50% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into manufacturing pharmaceuticals products are come from China. So we've got linked very, very closely with China. So anyone who has a sort of, get rid of China and let's do everything in India, and I don't think that's what they have in mind, but if they do, that's a silly idea.
No, let me come in on this. Omkar, that is precisely what they have in mind. In fact, from my conversations with people in government, I understand that this whole Atmanirbharta strategy is essentially focused on China. It's essentially, given the examples that you have given in pharmaceuticals and automobiles, to reduce dependence on Chinese imports. So there is actually, this is the focus of Atmanirbharta, that you reduce dependence on imports from China, because we tried to get the Chinese to reduce the trade deficit. It's a humongous trade deficit. For the last 10 years, both Manmohan Singh government and this government have tried. The last conversation between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping at Mahabalipuram was in fact partly of how to reduce the trade deficit. The Chinese are just not doing it. So now the Indian approach is, we will reduce our dependence. And I also think that you probably communicated this to the West, that look against you. This is aimed against China. I agree with you. It's not easy. It's not easy to reduce this dependence. It cannot be done overnight. But in the medium to long term, this is precisely the Indian strategy.
Well, I mean,
if that were the case, Sanjay and Dhiraj, then I think you will see in the next budget or somewhere in between some pretty heavy hikes on tariffs on certain kinds of products, which will come in from China.
Yeah, because I don't see this happening in any other way, because the fact is the Chinese economy is, and their policy environment is way more competitive than India's on several other, on a whole host of parameters, whether it's land, labor, electricity tariffs, the whole range of things. So either we fix those, which will probably take some time, or we raise tariffs, as Omkar says. We'll keep a watch on that. But a couple of things before we conclude. One is that, I mean, we're talking about stimulus and the government's role in helping revival of the economy. But beyond the near term, beyond 6 or 7 months, the engine for any sustained revival of growth has to be private investment. And that's what drove our high growth between 2003 and 8. We almost reached 40% of GDP. Now we are stuck at about 30 or under 30% of GDP for the last 8 or 9 years. Do you think there's enough trust between the government and the private sector to make this happen? I mean, in this package, there was certain announcement related to decriminalization of certain aspects of the Companies Act and so on. But do you think that there's an ecosystem in terms of trust, just trust, let's forget about policy for a minute, for investment to go back to those levels? Omkar?
I'm afraid not. It's not deep distrust, but it's not great trust. Okay. And also, everyone, I mean, including cash-rich companies, and I sit on the boards of some companies that are cash-rich, okay? And I interact with people who are on boards of other cash-rich companies. So basically companies that have internal funds. Everyone over the last 5 years, and now even more so, has a simple point of view: sweat your capital and watch and wait. And this watch and wait period is going to continue for another year or maybe 18 months as they sweat capital like nothing. So I don't see anything happening to the ratio of gross domestic capital formation to GDP going up in any way, unless it is massively done by public investments.
Sanjay, do you have a view on the trust factor?
Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree with Omkar, though I don't know if trust is the real problem or competence. I think we have to seriously consider whether the growth that was enabled by private investment between least to the mid-2000s has kind of worked itself out, and a new growth cycle requires now much greater public investment. That whether, leaving it to private investment alone, even if the trust levels are, improved, and the Prime Minister's reaching out to business in the last few days. Whether this will create additional trust is, whether they're the competence. They are cash rich, as Omkar says, but I'm not sure, first of all, whether they're willing to spend that cash in India. And that's not simply because of trust, it may also be because of lack of opportunity. And that is where public investment may have to step in. So I do think that to survive the growth cycle, you cannot depend only on private investment, and certainly you cannot depend on foreign investment. Some element of public investment has to come in, and that may then have some kind of...
I just want to come in on this, sorry, just a sentence, which is, it's absolutely true what Sanjay is saying, and what you are in a way alluding to but not saying, Dhiraj, is that this phase, if you want growth to occur, particularly in the post-COVID phase, in a very difficult situation, the biggest amount has to now come from solid public investment. And that brings you to a very simple thing, that solid public investment, one way or the other, if you were to measure it properly, requires you to open the exchequer. And you have to accept the fact that you will lead with greater fiscal deficit. The guys who run the fiscal deficit show are wanting to pass the buck on to RBI and not open the exchequer. But if you want public investment of the kind that will create some sense of a growth path going forward, you've got to now open the exchequer and take your chances.
In fact, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think stimulus has two elements. One is, of course, putting cash into people's hands, which has been talked a lot about, but the other is in terms of public investment, which needs to be ramped up significantly. And I think this is not really the time for the fiscal deficit hawks. Unfortunately, they seem to be the dominant ones in the narrative in the government at the moment. But the final couple of questions is that 40% of the workforce is still in agriculture. And I think we often ignore it in our conversations over here in terms of the economy going forward. There were two announcements made by the government, one on the Essential Commodities Act and one on APMC Act, and ending sort of monopolies for wholesalers. How significant are these for the agricultural economy on which several people depend? And now that a lot of migrant labor has gone back, even more people will depend on it. Do you think this is a real fillip to agricultural reform and agricultural growth? A quick comment from Omkar and Sanjay, both of you.
Yes, it is, if it is to be done. Both Sanjay and I have, got sufficient gray hair hearing about this reform time and time again. We've heard about AP agricultural marketing reform, agricultural price reform time and time again, and there have been enough political opposition to it at the ground level. So if it is done, I think it is going to be important and quite important. But let me see when it's done.
Sanjay?
These are important initiatives, and the proof of the pudding is in the... but I'll also add, this morning the papers say that the government is increasing support prices for various commodities. Important. I mean, putting money into the agrarian economy is useful. That will stimulate demand for manufactured goods. So, it's a classic stimulus, which is, I think, good.
So I'll take your final thoughts now. Clearly, both of you are not entirely optimistic about the prospects in the near term, but perhaps it would be useful if you could end in your concluding thoughts by giving three simple points that the government should consider to revive growth and to ensure that it's closer to zero or positive territory rather than negative territory. What would be the three things they can still do in the next 2 or 3 months? Omkar and then Sanjay.
First, I think you have to increase public expenditure. You choose them well, but you don't get niggardly about it. You choose them well in terms of the importance to the economy, and you choose them well in terms of how quickly you can deliver it, starting from the decision taken to the expenditure ministry, to whichever ministry it has to go, and then to the states. You have to increase expenditure, and somewhere down the line, people in North Block should be told, stop this nonsense that you have right now with your fiscal deficit business. Forget about it. We don't have an inflation risk. Do it. Second is the policy reforms that you have announced. Execute them. Okay. One of them you will have very difficult to do, which is the privatization part of it, because this is going to be a difficult time to get value. And the third, which Sanjay mentioned, is speak with coherence. You don't get a first prize for coming up with the longest possible answer sheet. You get a first prize for writing the right answers.
Sanjay,
That's a good one.
your concluding thoughts?
That's a good one. Well, I mean, again, I agree with everything that Omkar says, so I won't repeat him. But let me then add a completely non-economic, ending argument. I do actually believe that success policy depends critically on politics. The ability of the political leadership to convince economic actors, whether they are consumers or investors, that the focus of the political leadership is on reviving investment, reviving consumption, reviving, generating greater employment, that the economy is the focus. Unfortunately, that was not the message coming out after the elections of last May. This government, its first year of its second term. The whole focus between May last year until COVID broke out over the first 8 months of this year, Citizenship Amendment Bill and the politics of citizenship is a complete waste of time. But also it showed that the priority of the government was not the economy. You went in with a budget that was revised in 3 months. You got rid of the finance secretary who wrote the budget speech. So, the whole confusion around policy making in the first few months of the second term, in my judgment, added more to the problem of policy, the numbers in terms of investment and fiscal deficit and interest rate. So let me end by saying that the government has to get its politics right to get its economics right.
That's always critical. I mean, political economy is always the critical determining factor. And before we wrap up this extremely rich discussion, I think 3 points are clearly coming out. One, coherence and a clear pathway. Second, abandon fiscal fetishism, go for a fiscal expansion. And third, implement those structural reforms you announced. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Follow Roli Books on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you'll get more updates on further programs on in the series of Roli Pulse. Stay safe, stay well, and believe in books. Thank you.